Yeah, I was always a very curious kid, and if a lot of you guys look like you're my generation. Remember when we were kids, there was maybe 4 TV stations where we grew up. In Boston, we had PBS, then you had ABC, NBC, and CBS, and there wasn't a lot of programming, so you saw a lot of old movies. And of course, that generation that was producing that stuff, the people the age of that would have been producing those movies were all war vets. So guess what they made movies about? So I saw a lot of war movies back in the day. And then I'm looking through a map book one day, and I saw this tiny little island country, and I go, that's Japan? And then I looked at us and I went, what were they thinking? Like, how on earth do they think they're going to pull this off? They're just a little putsy little island country. So anyway, that was really what got me going, and any research you might have wanted to have done in those days was difficult because there weren't a lot of resources to talk about Japanese perspectives on their strategy and so forth. So let's get going. The objectives today for the discussion: first off, we're going to discuss Japanese policy, the developments in the 1930s, and how American strategic policy conflicted with the goals of the Japanese Empire, and analyze strategic planning for both sides. We're going to talk a little bit about America's op plan called Orange, and discuss, reveal how that could have had disastrous consequences if we'd ever really tried to execute it. And then finally assess reasons for Japanese failure in the Pacific War. But we can't have a strategic lecture without talking about my old friend here, Karl von Clausewitz. And again, to reiterate, war is a continuation of political activity by other means. The political object is the goal. And, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but just to put it this way. If I had just flown into Vero Beach, didn't know anybody here, never met anybody, and I'm walking down the street, and I see Father Josh coming my way, and I see him, and as soon as I get up to him, I just go, whammo! You would say, that guy's crazy. He just hit him for nothing. He's a maniac. What was he thinking? Well, then you peel the onion back a little bit, and you find out that Josh's family stole some land through some crazy wheeling dealing, and it had belonged to my family, and it was my land, and I got taken for hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate. You'd go, oh, that was his reason. That was his policy. His policy is to get back at those people that screwed him. Well, it's as simple as that. That's all policy is. It's what your ambition is, your goal is, what you want to accomplish. And it's kind of crazy how you arrive at political objectives, but that's subject for another discussion. And here's a big one too. We've talked a little bit about it in past lectures, but Clausewitz makes the point, operational strategies, what we choose as our military strategy, better be arrived at based on the degree to which it supports the political objective. Like strategy, policy match. And as the lecture unfolds, I'm going to show you when your strategy starts to violate and go beyond your policy objectives, you're just asking for trouble. And we'll show how that happened to the Japanese. Now this map, I got a lot to talk about with this map. You've probably seen it before in our earlier Midway lecture. But that red line represents what the Japanese viewed as their political objective in the 1930s. They called it the Greater East Area Co-Prosperity Sphere. And so here's a little bit of background in a nutshell. So if you're looking for more detail, you could ask specifically questions. But at the opening of the 20th century, Japan had just been a modernizing nation in some ways and opening up to the rest of the world. But it was ruled by kind of medieval thinking, shogun kind of people. They lived by this code of Bushido. And they came up with this great idea in 1905. I know, let's attack Russia and get Manchuria, because there's not many resources in Japan and lots in Manchuria. So let's grab it up. And now we'll have coal and iron and all this stuff that we want. So they do a sneak attack against Port Arthur. Surprise, surprise, they like that stuff. And they get into this war. It goes on for a couple of years. they come out with a nominal victory, but by the end of it, the Russians are finally getting a force out in Siberia that would just have been able to annihilate the Japanese forces, the remnants of what started the war. So at the end, even though they had won every battle, they were looking at disaster because the Russians had built up a force that could have slaughtered them if they decided to go for it. And that's about the time the Japanese are going, peace treaty, let's go to peace negotiations. So they end up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Theodore Roosevelt moderates it. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize for it, and they get a peace deal. And the peace is announced to the people in Japan and what they got out of the war, and they had made an enormous sacrifice in manpower and wealth to fight this thing, and they virtually got nothing. So they start, I mean, there's riots, there's upheaval in Japan like we couldn't even imagine. And that Bushido shogun type of character that had been running their government, those guys were kind of disgraced and finally pushed aside. And they had a fairly nice, modern, democratic government from the 1905, 1906 period onwards through the 20s. And everything was going pretty good. They did about 80 and 90% of their trade with the United States. And so what could go wrong, right? The Great Depression goes wrong. America, our economy collapses. One of the first measures the United States takes is to basically cut off trade with all outside nations. And so here's Japan, not a rich country to begin with. And this was absolutely economically catastrophic. And there's no social safety net there. They got starving people, and the place was just collapsing. So to resolve that, back come the Shogun Bushido Code mentality, Japanese leadership from the old days. They go, see, we told you, you can't trust the Gaijin. You know, we should be just dealing with Asian things, no outside trade with anybody. We're going to go out and conquer what we want, and we're going to create this East Asia Coast Prosperity Sphere. And that's the background for it. And the thing basically went to, what's the big target here for the Japanese? Might have just given it away. What's their big number one political objective? China. I mean, everybody wants Chinese trade. And does America like to trade with China? We actually, in the 19th century, we created a class of ship just to get to China faster, the clipper ships. So China is a vital national interest. Trade with China is a vital national interest for the United States, as well as Southeast Asia, because they had incredibly important strategic resources as well. And also, what's right in the middle of our area here? The Philippine Islands. They were an American territory after the Spanish-American War, and there's a huge, there's a 30,000-man army in the Philippines, and some representative naval forces. So, but that's the area of objective that they wanted. And again, American policy in the region is we want free access to the Chinese markets in Southeast Asia, support the Philippines, vital national interest. And I've told you this before. Anybody remember what I said? When I say vital national interest, what does that tell you in your brain? Vital national interest is something we will fight over. That's pushing us across the line of tolerance. So, and the British also have political empire holdings there too. Of course, Singapore, Hong Kong, and some other interesting stuff. So the number one enemy, though, is China, and they initiate hostilities in 1937. Now, America is still an isolationist nation, and despite the fact that they are violating our vital national interest, we don't go to war right away. There's no political will for it. You know, Americans have always been kind of more Eurocentric, and so we kind of let them get away with it. But America's pretty pissed off, especially our strategic leadership, and they would love to figure out a way of getting into this conflict to bar them from taking over China. What's their major strategic issues now, though? Is China going to be a pushover? No. They got a kind of a corrupt government, but you know, this is a big this is a big bite to try and take. Little Japan's going to go invade China and conquer them. It goes pretty good for the first several months because the Japanese are good at planning and surprise. So they get in there and things are going pretty good. But by 1941, before I skip a point, Japan to win in China needs a quick victory. Did they get it? No, not really. They're still fighting them in 1941. By 1941, it's an expensive stalemate. And during this whole time, and for the longest time, Japan has been dependent on who for fuel oil, scrap metal, and all the other resources they need. United States. So they're violating our vital national interests, but they're also reliant on us for these critical resources they have to have. So finally, in July 1941, Japan goes for southern French Indochina, which is basically South Vietnam. They invade, and that gives Roosevelt and the American leadership kind of the authority or the willingness to go along with an embargo. And they embargo scrap steel, aviation fuel, and oil from Japan. So think about this. The Japanese have well over 1 million guys fighting in China. And there's a lot of armor, tanks and all the other stuff you need, a lot of aviation, and they just got the fuel pump, just ran out of gas. So they got a very, very desperate situation going on now. Anybody got any idea what they're going to have to do? Where are they going to get gas?
Indonesia.
Yeah, it was the Dutch East Indies back in the day. But of course, Holland's immersed in conflict in Europe. So they're going to go try and take the Dutch East Indies. And the big problem with that is what we said before. Dutch East Indies is way down here to the southwestern corner of their objective area. But what, again, is right here, their surface lines of communication, their transit lines are going to have to go right by what? Philippines. So the Japanese figure that's going to be a big problem. And that becomes their next biggest strategic objective is the Philippines. They got to get America out of the Philippines. When we make no mistake, the U.S. leadership knew when we embargoed the oil, particularly, that would lead to a war. So we were just baiting them at that point because they were making no indications that they were going to back off from completely forcing their way into our vital areas. Here's some Japanese assumptions going into this. America would go to war over the invasion of the Philippines. They believed Americans were dishonorable, a mixed breed nation, bunch of mutts, were decadent, lazy, unreliable. Might be true today. Americans would have no tolerance for long-term war or any taking significant losses. Americans didn't care about the political configuration of Asia, and they were somewhat true. Again, Americans were, especially then, were so Eurocentric, they didn't know what was going on in the Pacific. And decisive naval victory would end American efforts to contest the Western Pacific. Now, since the Japanese had read Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, they figured out what we need to do. They prepared for the eventuality of war with America. And so they created the red line around the area, the prosperity sphere kind of recognizes where they're going to put their defenses. And they tailor their force to defend that. They put up a ring of steel and tailor their forces. They had a large land army for that war in mainland Asia. Well over 1 million people fighting in China. They had ample land-based air that they were going to station out on the barrier islands. That would be like the Marshalls and Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, there's a chain that runs through there. And that open gap between like Wake Island and mainland Japan. It's kind of an open ocean area. That's why they had 10 aircraft carriers to defend that area. So, they figured this out. And they had other mobile forces to flex the areas of operation within the Pacific that they needed. So, of course, despite how it might have been portrayed at the time, or the way you think about it, Japan had neither the intention or nowhere near the ability to actually invade America. This is what they wanted. America's response, because everybody kind of sort of knew what each side was doing, America's response was kind of a simple plan. We called it War Plan Orange. And it envisioned the Japanese attack versus the Philippines to open the hostilities. And in response, the United States Navy surface force, led by battleships and cruisers, would transit across, engage the Japanese blockade force around the Philippines, of course, kick their ass, and once we relieved the Philippines, the U.S. Navy would then they would proceed to the Japanese home waters for a decisive battle and win the war. Anybody see any problems with that one? They figured out in a war game in 1933, it was actually called Operations Problem 4 War Game, and the Blue Fleet, which is the good guys in exercise, the bad guys are orange, and the good guys are blue. It resulted in a defeat for the hypothetical Blue Fleet. It revealed that the plan didn't factor in Japanese submarines and aviation threats, or long-range surface lines of communication. When I say SWAC, think transit. But think about this. Look at the distances in the Pacific, and we are going to have to transit across the entire length of the Pacific. They got a submarine force that can reach anywhere in the Pacific. And if they really were determined to go for it, how hard would it be when you got over 3,000-mile long SWACs? How hard is it going to be to interdict those lines of communication, transit, and supplies? Well, anyway, as a result of the bad Operation 4 War Game, our Navy determined that a methodical offensive was going to be needed. We're going to have to grab up some of those Pacific islands where they based all the land-based air that were knocking out our battleships 100 miles out. But it was not a really well thought out remedy for what caused our defeat. They didn't envision Japanese strongholds on the island. And they didn't, the leadership of the Navy at that time didn't, for some reason, they didn't have the ability to envision what aviation power could do to surface warfare ships. So, if this scenario unfolded, and this is all the planned for stuff. If this scenario unfolded, Japanese take the Philippines. They're in the process of it. There's a blockade force around it. They've got their aviation pilot out on the islands and the carriers out there. And here comes the U.S. 7th Fleet leaving Hawaii, led by a dozen battleships, heading towards the Philippines. What do you think would have happened?
They bombed us.
Speak up.
They bombed the 7th Fleet.
Yeah. As soon as they were in range of their long-range bombers, they're going to start attacking. As soon as they get closer, they're going to throw more aircraft at it. They're never going to get there. These are 13-knot ships against 300, they were state-of-the-art naval air forces. And there's thousands of them. They're based on aircraft carriers, they're based on island fortresses built up. If you really think about it hard and study it, that 7th Fleet heading for the Philippines had about a snowball's chance in hell of getting there. So then what happens? What do you think the public response is going to be? When they attack the Philippines, which most Americans could give a darn about, so that may piss off some people, but we send the 7th Fleet across there, and we lose the entire thing. The fleet's annihilated. What's going to be the Americans' public response to that? About a year into this. It's now late 1942. We just lost the fleet. We're going to rebuild the whole thing. Don't forget we're at war with Germany, because right after Japan attacked us, Germans came in against us. So we got two-front war. What do you think the American people were thinking about the Pacific in that scenario?
Getting out.
Yeah, I mean, if Americans ever backed out of things when things weren't going too bad. Yeah, you know, that's one of the things I think is quite probable. Joe Sixpack in Chicago does not care about the Filipinos. He's not going to be, gung-ho, I want to sacrifice my life so we can secure trade with China and make sure the Philippines is not conquered by the Japanese. And everybody else is like, holy crap, we just lost 15,000 sailors when we lost the entire, very expensive battleship fleet. So there's a good argument to be made that they might have just said, the heck with it. If nothing else, we had a Germany first policy in those days anyway. So the Japanese, if they had accomplished wiping out the fleet, they really didn't have much to worry about from us, the way they looked at it, one of their assumptions. They don't have to worry about us too much. Probably the next year, year and a half, they can do a lot more defensive stuff out there. So that's what they were thinking. You can see they had a real fighter's chance. If everything goes right, they might have been able to pull it off. And you know, this allows me to get a segue of one of my pet peeves of after 30 years, almost 30 years of naval service. How you transition from peace to war, especially in leadership. In the 1920s, 1930s, the war plan orange kind of highlights a major problem. You've got knuckleheads in charge of the strategic leadership of our critical naval forces. And so, the problem is, after prolonged peace, how do you select or appoint competent wartime leaders? What metrics do you use when there's been peace for 20 or 30 years, or more? The metrics that we used a lot when I was on active duty, one of the big ones, if you were a commanding officer, how was your retention? You know, mine when I was a commanding officer wasn't too good, because when I got bad sailors, and they came to captain's mast, which was non-judicial punishment, those guys were, if they did enough, sayonara, they're going home. But that's bad for my retention. So I'm thinking my command a better place because I'm getting rid of these deadbeats. But I'm hurting myself with potential selection for higher ranks or commands because my retention isn't as good as my colleague down the other side of the hangar bay. So that's one. Inspections, of course. You'd have to have a personal, squeaky clean record. I've always said you had to be a brown-nosed ass kisser. And what's a common characteristic would you think of people like? They're going to be risk takers, risk averse. What do you think?
Risk averse.
Absolute risk averse. They're not going to get out of line for a second where somebody can say, hey, wait, no, I think that might. No, they're going to be going right down the line. So the leadership that emerges from periods like that are really risk-averse, status quo kind of thinkers, very limited vision, and that's not the guys you want leading you into the big war in the Pacific. So anyway, and another thing, risk-averse people, when they're planning for war, their tendency is to plan to fight the last war you were in. Results in very, very static thinking. And what was the last real maritime war America was in? World War I was really anti-submarine warfare and convoy duties. So it wasn't a big naval war. The last big war was the Spanish-American War, which is, Commodore Dewey in the Philippines, you may fire when ready, Gridley, and, blowing everything up. And so the predominant ship of the United States Navy, as a result of that history, is the battleship. And if you want to be an admiral and a leader in the Navy at the highest levels, you had to go through that career path of being a battleship guy. And so here you got a picture here on the slide. That's Husband Kimmel on the upper left. He was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet the day of Pearl Harbor. That's a USS Arizona next to him. That was a very, very similar battleship to the one he commanded. He commanded USS New York. But there's the Arizona when it's steaming around, and there's the Arizona on December 7th in the bottom left. And Kimmel was synonymous with Warplane Orange. Remarkably limited vision of how to utilize naval aviation or submarines. They described what those guys were going to do in a very nebulous, almost nondescript supply or support role. But if you tried to tie him down, I don't think he could give you a real good answer. Like, what are we going to do with our aircraft carriers? What are we going to do with our land-based air? It just wasn't thought out. They think they're just going to go in there and slug it out with Japanese cruisers and battleships. As a naval aviator, we used to make fun of the surface warfare guys. We'd say they're a bunch of 12-knot brains, and in those days, I'm sure their speed would probably, we'd say they're 12-knot brains and we're 500-knot brains, competing with 500-knot brains. Back in those days, it was probably a 300-knot brain for an aviator. But surface warfare guys from the beginning, we all wore khaki uniforms on the ship. Surface warfare guys wore black shoes, and aviators wore brown shoes. So we called each other by his shoes, like they were black shoes. And when we saw him, and it would, you ever see Jerry Seinfeld when he meets Newman? He goes, "Hello, Newman." It's like, "Hello, black shoes." It was the same thing. 12-knot brains in a 300-knot war. The entire sink pack fleet staff, I even actually looked this up, senior staff were all black shoes. So there's not an aviator in there giving the Admiral any insight on what the potential uses of aviation were. Within 10 days of Pearl Harbor, they fixed the problem. They fired Kimmel. They appointed a real long shot named Chester Nimitz. And this was really a huge surprise to everybody in the Navy. So whoever's making this decision, and I can't tell you who it was probably one of the most brilliant decisions in the history of our warfare and these types of things. Because Nimitz, he was only a rear admiral. He wasn't even a senior rear admiral. He just put on his second star, and they reach down and grab him and say, "Come here, you're gonna be a 4-star and you're gonna command the Pacific Fleet." And he's like, "Sure, why not?" But that's unprecedented, and it does a lot of things. It creates a need to reassign all those admirals who were senior to him. So all these old 12-knot brain knuckleheads had to get rousted out because you couldn't have somebody senior to Nimitz around the Pacific because now you're going to have some real conflicts going on. They completely rebuilt the entire sink pack fleet staff around submariners and aviators as fast as they could. But Nimitz, can't say enough about him. The guy was Superman. He was a submarine guy himself, but he was so brilliant that he understood everything that he needed to know about aviation, but of course submarine ops. But anyway, under our scenario that we've been going through of what the plans were, by April 1942, the Japanese would have achieved all of their political objectives. So if you're the Japanese, if you're Commander-in-Chief Japanese forces, what do you do now? What was your next step going to be? What do you think?
Decimate the U.S. fleet.
What?
Decimate the U.S.
You already did. You got nothing to worry about.
in Hawaii.
Well, if I was them, I wouldn't do anything. I'd just build up those defenses, the Marianas, Wake Island, Gilbert Islands. I'd put airfields in there, load up all the fuel I could get out there, and just wait. Because if they never come, that's fine. But if they come, they're going to pay. They're going to cross the line and they're going to get schwacked. So I think best bet for them is just stay put, hold what you got, build it up, make it tougher, and they've got the oil resources now. They secured the East Indies oil, and they're golden. And another thing, the U.S. is not a serious threat after they killed everybody trying to go relieve the Philippines. We got Germany first, and now we got to rebuild an entire fleet. How long is that going to take? A couple of years. So declare victory, dig in, and wait for what happens next, and concentrate on finishing the deal in China. And that's a pretty good overview of what they were thinking. And it could have worked. Could have worked if they didn't screw it up. So let's shift to reality, what they did do. What went wrong? And it went real wrong in that bottom picture. Mistake number one, the Pearl Harbor raid. First giant miscalculation. What do you think is the first thing bad about this? Does it support, let me put it this way. Does attacking Pearl Harbor support the policy objective? If the policy objective is to go out to that red line on the map, what is going 1,000 extra miles and attacking your potential enemy, what does that do for you? Nothing. You couldn't take it, you couldn't hold it. Their idea is we'll just wipe out the Pacific Fleet, but they had every advantage of being able to defeat the Pacific Fleet as it was. So what did it do for them? I don't think it did a thing for them, really. The strategy does not match the policy. It's 2,500 miles from the Marshall Islands to Hawaii, and the Marshall Islands being where they would have had land-based air. I mean, this is so far beyond where they need to be. And it fuels something that they never anticipated. America's response. You know, they think we're a bunch of decadent mutt slug cowards. I mean, we allowed them to violate our vital national interests from 1937 to 41. They didn't think too much of us. They didn't anticipate. They had just awakened the proverbial sleeping lion. Yamamoto might have said that, but it's often misquoted or misunderstood. The Japanese didn't anticipate President Roosevelt and his remarkable ability to shape public opinion. His address to Congress on December 8th had a dramatic effect. Now, again, I was a curious kid about this when I was little, and I remember asking all my older adult relatives, parents, grandparents, about Pearl Harbor, and like, what did you think? What would you think is going to happen? And you know, when we went through 9/11, I kind of got the same answers in my own head to what they were thinking. They didn't know what to think. You know, Japan, they're watching Germany and Poland and all that other stuff going on. What are the Japanese thinking? They thought that whole thing was crazy. They were confused. Like, is this some kind of misunderstanding? They didn't get it. And so they didn't know what we were going to do or what we should do. Well, December 8th, Roosevelt told them. They were shocked. They were outraged. But Roosevelt goes on the mic. And Roosevelt in that era was just brilliant at using this new medium, radio, for forming public opinion and getting something he wanted. He was really remarkable for his era. I'll give you a contrast. When Great Britain declared war on Germany, Neville Chamberlain was the prime minister. And to announce to the nation that they were going to war, he goes on in his conference room at 10 Downing Street. And this is my best Neville Chamberlain impersonation. There's no background noise or anything. It's just very quiet. And he goes, Neville Chamberlain now, I am speaking to you from the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government the final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, that a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. You can imagine what a bitter blow this is to me, that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Now, that's not exactly going to inspire all the youth of Great Britain to run down to the Marine Corps recruit office and say, sign me up. You know, he put more fear into the people than he did to inspire anybody, obviously. You've all seen, I'm sure, at one time or another, Roosevelt going before Congress to give the declaration of war speech. The first thing you hear on the YouTube videos or whatever is this: if you listen on the radio, all you hear is this raucous cheering, yeah, yeah, and clapping and screaming, and Roosevelt comes in, and he's brilliant. He goes over the date. You know, he emphasizes that date because he wants to have a motto. He wants something that ties the listener's emotions to every time you hear that date, that you remember the passion you felt when you heard that they killed our guys, they sank our ships. He uses words like infamy, suddenly and deliberately. Of course it was sudden and deliberate. Infamous, look how we opened the war with Iraq in both cases. We didn't announce, hey, we're declaring war on you now, we're going to attack you tomorrow morning. That's just a typical way you do it. But he turns this into the crime of the century. He reported severe damage and many lives lost just to fuel the public outrage. He goes on to say, because he understands everybody's Eurocentric. He says there are reports of American ships torpedoed between Honolulu and San Francisco, which was not true. But in an era when most Americans would have trouble finding Hawaii on a map, they knew where the hell San Francisco was. That's Joe DiMaggio's hometown. We know where that is, and there's Jap ships out there. Holy crap! Gee, they're right off the shore. He makes very critical points. No matter how long it may take us, which equals basically this is going to be an all-out national effort. Anti-war movement, all you skeptics about it, sit down and shut up, because you're not going to be heard. He calls it a premeditated invasion. Well, there was no invasion. And where do you hear the word premeditated most frequently?
Israel.
Huh?
Israel.
Premeditated in our everyday conversations? Murder. It's murder. Premeditated murder against us was my take. America in its righteous might. So we're righteous. We have the just cause. We'll win through to absolute victory, which is a statement in and of itself. What does absolute victory mean? We're going to kill every one of them. We're going to take over their country, because there's other levels you could define a victory. Make sure we push them back to within their home island. There's a lot of things short of invading Japan and taking over that would constitute victory. But he commits us to, he called it absolute victory. He says, I interpret the will of the people. No polls, no nothing. It's kind of like I'm taking over because I interpret the will and I'm deciding what we're going to do. No polls, no debate. We will fight to the uttermost. Uttermost means extreme, greatest, or highest degree. Maximum national effort. FDR asserts that we will make it certain that this form of treachery will never again endanger us. Well, that breaks the isolationist argument forever, because we allowed that form of treachery to exist. For us to make sure it never threatens us again means we will have to be out in the world from now on, forever, making sure the world is the way we want it, because we're not going to allow these agents to run amok and do what the hell they want, like we are today. We're kind of finally backing off of Roosevelt's mantra that we're going to control the world's events. He once again demonizes the Japanese and goes on to say, our stuff is in grave danger, but we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. So God is on our side. Goes on to demonize them some more, unprovoked and dastardly attack. It's going to be a long slog. He invokes the date again to reinvigorate that, associate the passion of and hatred and determination every time you hear that date. You're gonna, I mean, to this day, I gave a speech in Vero at the old, across from the old library courthouse on Pearl Harbor Day. And I mean, we're still memorializing Pearl Harbor Day. He did such an incredible job of immortalizing that date. So anyway, my opinion, Pearl Harbor, mistake number one, because after that speech, everybody knew what we were going to do, and people were lined up at recruiting offices in every city in America. They were lined up around the block. They couldn't sign up fast enough, and the ranks swelled remarkably in the shortest amount of time. I got to move a little quicker. I think I'm talking too much. Mistake number two, Battle of Midway. Is that inside or outside their political objective area? Outside, well outside. It's over 1,500 miles from the sphere's outer limits. So once again, their military strategy doesn't match their policy. And they had like 10 aircraft carriers. They'd lost one at Coral Sea, so they're down to 9. And those guys, their objective when they built it was to defend that open area between Wake Island to Japan. Now they're taking 8 of them and sending 4 of them to the Aleutians and 4 of them to Midway. Not a good use of what you designed that stuff for. And even, let me ask you this, what do you think? Because it's 2,600 miles from Midway to Japan, 1,500 miles from the Marshall Islands. Even in best case, if they had won the Battle of Midway, could they hold it? What if we send our submarine force out there all along that 2,600 miles and sink every supply ship heading for Midway? You could have the Japanese fleet out there and no gas. I mean, this is a completely untenable, ridiculous plan. And the best thing they could hope for was they could get home from there. Anyway, their force, and it was extremely vulnerable because they didn't configure their Navy to protect surface lines of communication, transit lines. They didn't have very good anti-submarine warfare capabilities in their Navy, very limited supply capabilities, so they couldn't have sustained anything out on Midway anyway. Mistake number 3, incredibly terrible operational security. Magic and Purple were our code names for the programs where we broke their codes. Thanks to our code breaking efforts, we knew that every time the Japanese wanted to do something, we knew about it. Magic was a diplomatic code, Purple was an operational code, and despite our preparedness, and we used those codes judiciously, but every time the Japanese did something, we magically knew what they were doing. But the Japanese never caught on. They never figured out, there's this coincidence. Every time we want to go somewhere, all these American aircraft carriers show up, or things to that effect. At Midway, those failures left 4 of their aircraft carriers flaming torches. So simple mistakes, not just being a little more cynical about the codes for one thing, can cost a lot. Loss of one aircraft carrier, even for the United States today, is a national disaster because it's a national asset. Same thing for them. Loss of 4 is a total cataclysmic event. The aircraft are replaceable, but and the only good thing that came out of this is they rescued most of the aviators off those 4 carriers. So they still got aviators, and they had planes back home. So that wasn't the worst, but losing the 4 carriers, horrendous. Mistake number 4, zero intelligence capability. You might say, well, shoot, we rounded up all the Japanese and put them in internment camps. Yeah, that's true, but there was a lot of Axis, German, Italian spies in America. This was the Chicago Sunday Tribune right after the Battle of Midway. I think, I can't read the date, June early June 1942, so it's right after the Battle of Midway. And if you see the headline under the big one, right in the middle, Navy had word of Jap plan to strike at sea. Knew Dutch Harbor was a feint. Story goes on to say how we broke their codes, and everything that the Japanese needed to know that the codes had been compromised was published in that story. It went out to the public, and the Japanese never caught on. They had and they didn't ever work on any intelligence capability before or during the war. So for Japan, what next? They just lost the Battle of Midway. It's the middle of 1942. Despite the loss of the 4 carriers, they still had maritime superiority for the time being until all the new American stuff gets out there. So what did they decide to do? Again, what would you do? If it was me, I'm going to double down on my defenses, see if I can somehow replace the 4 carriers and get some more aviation capability out there. But I'm not doing anything to antagonize these Americans anymore. But they come up with this really stupid idea. I mean, this is one of the stupidest things you'll ever read about in strategic decision making. They go into and start to build an airfield in the Solomon Islands on an island, Guadalcanal. And it's not just one mistake, it's a huge series of mistakes that goes into this. Guadalcanal was not on anybody's radar scope, like, let's go there. It had no strategic value. Somebody that thinks they know about Pacific War history will say, well, it threatened the transit lines. I'll say transit lines because SLOCs, it's a Navy term. It threatened the transit lines coming into Hawaii. Well, it really didn't. If you look at a map and figure out the distances, it's about 1,000 miles to the nearest transit line. And aircraft in those days didn't have that combat radius. So they would have had to have moved further south. And it would have been so easy to interdict anybody trying to go 1,000 miles out there. You know, there were islands in between the transit lines and where the Guadalcanal was. So we could have thrown our own fighters out there and shot everything down. Guadalcanal was never a focus of U.S. interest. As a matter of fact, at the time, MacArthur was heavily engaged in a hugely important campaign for both of our sides, but more for the Japanese than us on New Guinea. Remember, New Guinea is very important because it's kind of the key to going and grabbing back the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. So the real focus for Japan should have been, every resource should have been going to New Guinea. But there were still things they could have done with this that would have been pretty smart compared to what they did do. First Marine Division goes on Guadalcanal. 16,000 Marines land on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, August 1942. And the Navy's there, of course, to pour in supplies. Now this sets up a perfect opportunity for the Japanese. If they play this right, maybe they can just draw us in there and just attrite American forces. Just use it as kind of a sinkhole, and you know, we now have to support those Marines there and use this just to knock off our naval resources and make it a kill field for Americans. It starts right after we get there. Battle of Savo Island, worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. It's a total disaster, and the supply ships supplying the Marines on Guadalcanal had to get out of town because they were now exposed. The results are, every night, the Japanese Navy can come down to Guadalcanal and bombard the Marines on the island and the field down there, Henderson Field. They could use submarines as the Navy ships came back to try and reintroduce themselves into the Solomon Island area, use their subs, inflict damage on the fleet. There's no good reason for the Japanese to squander any land forces on that island. They had 16,000 Marines stuck there. Just use that. You know, they're going to have to supply them. The Japanese are going to just bomb them and make life miserable for them. So the Marines are out there without any support. And the one thing they had, their lifeline, was Henderson Field. It's the only lifeline to the outside world. And it was the subject of nightly naval bombardments by the Japanese. By day, they could put up enough aircraft to drive the surface Navy ships of the Japanese fleet back, but really it was a barely tenable position the Marines were in. And again, just leave it like that. Just kill them. Just kill Marines and sink any ships that come in there. And it was working. Early September, Japanese sub sank USS Wasp, an aircraft carrier. They damaged USS Saratoga. They had to go back to Washington to get repaired. 2 aircraft carriers down. They torpedoed a battleship, USS North Carolina. So the Marines are completely isolated. This is costing us huge. It's another justification. Just keep doing it. You don't need forces on there. But late August, early September, they do the stupid move. They throw in a pretty good-sized force on Guadalcanal. Another stupid thing they did is they put it all in piecemeal. They didn't put in like 20,000 guys in there at once and just crush the Marines. They put in 8,000, and then they'd get killed, and then they'd throw in another 5,000. And it went like that. They had absolutely terrible battlefield intelligence, so they repeatedly underestimated the Marines' strength. And one of the culminating things at Guadalcanal was in September 12th and 14th. 6,200 Japanese soldiers assaulted that ridge south of Henderson Field. It was defended by a guy named Colonel Mike Edson, Red Edson they called him, and he had, I guess, just a battalion of Marine raiders. It was 840 Marines. And just one of those kind of typical Japanese attacks. They just came in waves. A Marine participant, Captain William McKinnon, said the Japanese attack was almost constant, like rain that subsides for a moment and then pours the harder. When one wave was mowed down, I mean mowed down, another followed it into death. And in that battle, 2-night battle, those Marines shattered the entire Japanese brigade. They lost 3/4 of their men. And I don't know how well you can see this picture, but it just shows the intensity of the fighting. In the haze at the top of the land area, you can see the Marines. There's some Marines coming out of their foxholes. That had to be their position at the top of that ridge. And you can see the Japanese bodies lying just feet away from where they were. Now, it's not usually, in a strategic sense, worth talking about a small battle like that. I mean, it was a pretty gruesome battle, but it wasn't any huge engagement. But it had gigantic strategic effects. On 15 September, Imperial General Headquarters of the Japanese Imperial Headquarters learned of the defeat. In an emergency session, Army and Navy command staffs concluded that Guadalcanal might develop into the decisive battle of the war. Why they came up with that, I can't even begin to imagine. But it led to a significant revision of Japanese operations in far more important areas of the Pacific, specifically New Guinea. They diverted major Japanese forces from New Guinea for this, compounding this error of going to Guadalcanal. The irony is, Kawaguchi's Edson Ridge assault was the high point for the Japanese in that battle, because they never came as close to success on Guadalcanal as they did that night. And it leads to a new kind of 20th century or modern warfare new concept. And it was called trends. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. The naval battles for Guadalcanal, 12 to 13 November. The Japanese decided in November, okay, we're going to put 11,000 more troopers in here. Here they come. They come down escorted by a pretty good Japanese task force. It's an incredibly desperate battle. The ships were all intermingled, total chaos, utterly confused short-range melee. 2 American admirals, Callahan and Scott, killed in action. And pretty much that American task force that engaged the Japanese that night, they were annihilated. Japanese had superior optic sights, well-practiced night battle drill, significant Japanese victory, but they couldn't land the 11,000 troopers. They kind of had to push those guys back for safekeeping. So the 14th to 15th, they decide, let's try it again. But this is where this concept of trends comes in, and I'll explain that after this discussion here. 14-15 November, here they come again with the 11,000 troopers that they're going to reinforce Guadalcanal with. But now, finally, the new stuff, the equipment that have been building is now coming into the theater of war. And in this particular battle, USS Washington, a brand new battleship, and these ships are so new, they didn't even know how to use their own gear very well. They had never drilled together or anything like that. They're just like rookies just thrown out there in an NFL playoff game or something. But Washington comes in, it has surface radar, kind of a primitive computer that could match track the radar returns and so forth. They had flashless gunpowder. But they were so experienced that sister ship U.S. South Dakota was with it. The chief engineer screwed something up on their circuit panel and basically lights out on the South Dakota. They were without electrical power, so they had to withdraw from the battle. And there were some other destroyers along with Washington, but to make a long story short, almost single-handedly, this new battleship annihilates this vaunted Japanese task force. It just goes steaming right in the middle of it. It has 16-inch guns, radar with accurate computing on range and distance and so forth, and they just annihilate them. One ship. And there was additional air attacks in the morning that destroyed the rest of the transports. Ultimately, out of the 11,000 reinforcements going to Guadalcanal, 9,000 were dead. The Battle of Guadalcanal goes on to February, but the outcome was kind of a foregone conclusion. Had huge strategic impact. Japanese aviators, that's really when all the experienced Japanese naval aviators got killed. Huge losses and stuff that they couldn't make up for. Mistake number 6 is this, what I call cultural obsolescence. The Japanese, you've all seen stuff about Shogun, and if you know anything about the code of Bushido or the code of the samurai, those things are all pretty medieval. And they were trying to still apply those concepts to their behavior in war. And doesn't really convey well to the 20th century. An example, they would not use their submarines to attack undefended supply ships. It's only honorable to attack a combatant ship. The Japanese would not convoy their own merchant ships or use combatant ships to protect their merchant ships. Their code of honor pushed them to abandon their original defensive war scheme. The Midway raid was a result of, everybody know about the Doolittle raid? When Jimmy Doolittle and his squadron of B-17s, were they? Whatever, he took those Air Force bombers off of an aircraft carrier and attacked Japan in early 1942. And, all the military leadership in Japan lost face because they had promised the emperor they'd never be bombed. Well, here they come, the first few months of the war. So that's kind of what drove the Japanese high commands to abandon their sane defensive program to go attack something like Midway, way outside their objective area. Their no-surrender mentality in battle wasn't real brilliant either. They'd fight good fights, and then they'd get to a point where, it was a foregone conclusion. We kind of had it, and instead of withdrawing their forces, what did they do? Let's go banzai and get everybody killed here. So they took, untold tens of thousands of casualties. They could have withdrawn to fight another day. They also never supported troops with adequate supplies or medical facilities. And here's another really stupid thing. They never rotated any of their experienced people, particularly pilots, into training command after they had some requisite experience where they could be a good instructor pilot. So I don't know how they even manned their training command for pilots, but other than the guys out in the fleet, they could barely get these guys to teach them to take off and land. And it really shows up, if anybody ever heard of the Marianas Turkey Shoot, it was when we were getting near the invasion of the Philippines. And the Japanese just sent literally thousands of aircraft against our forces, and U.S. Navy fighters, I forget the numbers, I should have looked them up, but we shot down hundreds and hundreds of these guys, and lost virtually none of our own aviation assets. So they didn't rotate personnel into training rows, and these critical mistakes, and there are more, delayed or distracted the Japanese from their original strategy, which could have given them a real chance to win their objective. And again, it allowed us to introduce a new concept in modern war. It was labeled Episodes and Trends by Winston Churchill. And it's like this: an episode represents an event, like a battle, okay? So an event can be won or lost, but it doesn't necessarily dictate the outcome of a war. So Battle of Midway, that's an event. Pre-20th century, oftentimes a battle could be a decisive event, like the Battle of Sedan or Austerlitz or Waterloo. You go out and have one big fight, we win the war. But not in the 20th century. There's massive national armies, and so it resulted in lengthy interconnected battles of attrition. World wars did not have war-ending decisive battles. And what we ended up doing was use overwhelming power to grind them down. And of course, buildup of troops is a trend. 1940, there was 430,000 total Americans in our military. By the end of the war, it's over 16 million. So it takes a while to build that up. But just to give you an idea of the scope of the trends, the buildup of supplies and so forth, it's just some of these assembly lines. B-25s here. And here's another brilliant thing they did back in the day. During the Depression, we were broke as a joke. In the 1930s, late 20s and 1930s, our future enemies were all getting ready for war. Like the Italians were the first. They start buying up and stocking up arms in the late 20s. The Germans kind of mid-30s, they really start getting their act together. The Japanese were building up stuff heavily from the 33, 34 up to the war. So they essentially loaded up on their gear. By 1937, 39, that's when their major procurement and research and development of new stuff was done. Americans didn't do that. We were pretty smart about it. We deferred mass procurement, even though we knew eventually we were going to be in this. But we did invest very heavily in developing prototypes, particularly true in aviation. So we'd get these test aircraft out there, and a bunch of these, aviation whizzes would fly them and fly them and fly them, all kinds of missions and configurations, and they came up with some of the finest aviation design and motors and everything else imaginable. And then when we finally go to war, we push the button and start producing these things. So USS Washington is a perfect example. When they come to the Solomon Islands for that battle, I mean, this ship was like, what was that movie, The Final Countdown, when the USS Nimitz goes back in time tonight? It was practically that, It was so far advanced beyond anything the Japanese had. And now so are the tens of thousands of aviation assets we're putting out there. B-29s, assembly lines of tanks. We built 31 fleet aircraft carriers. They started the war with 10. We built 31 and 122 escort carriers. I mean, that's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. 18 American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships in 4 years. That's an average of 3 ships every 2 days. I don't know if you could see this well, but summary of production. I mean, that's the comparables of the Axis, which includes Germany and Italy. I mean, come on, it's like, this isn't even fair anymore. But I think it is, really, because despite that, to me, the winning edge, the trends are great. And I always felt like, I had some of the best stuff out there when I flew and was out on our aircraft carriers. You want that kind of an advantage in war. But I am not one of those guys that summarizes it all. My dad used to say this: we won because we outproduced them. Yeah, we outproduced them by a lot. But I'll give the floor to a guy I admire, especially in his speechifying, General Douglas MacArthur, on the subject of what was it that really won the wars. And his famous speech at West Point, I'll read this, it's kind of a part of the speech. He said to the cadets, "And what sort of soldiers are those you are to lead? Are they reliable? Are they brave? Are they capable of victory? Their story is known to all of you. It is the story of the American man at arms. My estimate of him was formed on the battlefields many, many, many years ago and has never changed. I regarded him then as I regard him now, as one of the world's noblest figures, not only as one of the finest military characters, but also as one of the most stainless. But when I think of his patience under adversity, of his courage under fire, and of his modesty in victory, I am filled with an emotion of admiration I cannot put into words. He belongs to history as furnishing one of the greatest examples of successful patriotism." At one point he says, "Their resolute and determined defense, their swift and sure attack, their indomitable purpose, their complete and decisive victory, always through the bloody haze of their last reverberating shots, the vision of gaunt, ghastly men, reverently following their password of duty, honor, country. However horrible the incidents of war may be, the soldier who is called upon to offer and give his life for his country is the noblest development of mankind." And I agree. The grit and determination of those Americans that fought is what won the war. It's nice to have the best weapons. Japanese had good weapons too. They devised remedies for a lot of what we came up with. And don't ever lose sight of the point, the biggest point. The decisive battles that turned the tide of war, Midway and Guadalcanal, were fought by poorly trained, very poorly supplied Americans fighting with obsolete weapons against far superior forces who had state-of-the-art gear. And even later in the war, after all the new equipment was in the fight, you've probably seen a lot about the Battle of Iwo Jima. We took 26,000 American casualties. When you read about what those guys had to go through there and later at Okinawa, 26,000 American casualties on an island that's 8 square miles. At the Battle of Okinawa, 386 ships were damaged, 68 ships sunk. The Navy took almost 10,000 casualties. The total for all services, 50,000. So yeah, it's great to have the gear, but you got to have people that'll go in there and endure what it took to use them and defeat that enemy. They persevered and they fought through it all to victory, always victory. And that's all I have on the subject. Does anybody have any questions?
Do you think the Japanese ambassador knew they were going to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. We had the codes. We had the diplomatic codes. We knew when we were in negotiations with them, they had set October as the time frame. If they didn't get something done, they were going to go to war. We just didn't know where, because it was diplomatic codes. They didn't outline any operational stuff. And so everybody on Earth is figuring the Philippines. And again, those surface warfare officers in charge of the fleet had no concept that aviation could extend that kind of power that far. So there's a scene in that movie, husband Kimball runs out in Pearl Harbor and they're dropping bombs around him and he goes, Jesus Christ. And I'm like, no, stupid. You screwed this up. You know, you should have known. But he was completely surprised like everybody else was. Yeah.
Do you think the H-bomb was necessary?
The A-bomb?
Yeah.
Interesting question, because studied a lot about that at the War College, war termination. If you were going to decide, if you decided, and Roosevelt had committed us to absolute total victory, so unlimited, we're going to take the place over and change it into something that's going to be peaceful in the future. The planners were getting, and nobody knew about that. Even Truman didn't know about it when he was vice president. So the A-bomb is coming along, but nobody knows. And out in the Pacific, all the major headquarters are doing their planning for amphibious landing on Japan. And if you remember from anything about the lecture on amphibious landing, you got to have specific geography to do one. Has to be near an industrial port to get your stuff ashore after you make a beachhead. And in Japan, because of its geography, there's literally only one place you could do it. Now everybody has this vision that the Japanese were defeated. You know, we'd rolled them up. Don't forget, they had well over 1 million guys in China. So what do you think when it became apparent, here come the Americans, what did they do with those 1 million guys? They're all veteran troopers and they brought them back to defend the home island. So they have a hugely robust land force in the one place, defending the one place that they know we have to come ashore. And make a long story short, American planners figured well over 1 million casualties to do it, and they couldn't guarantee success. So at a certain point, well into the planning, they were telling their leadership, we don't think we can do this. So, interesting, I read Truman's biography by McCullough, and I was interested in getting to that point in the book, like what was Truman thinking? You know, did he anguish? He didn't anguish a bit. They came in, he's president, and these generals come in and go, Mr. President, we got to tell you about something. He goes, well, what do you got? He goes, well, sir, we have this weapon. He's like, what? And he tell him about the bomb. Yeah, JP.
Paul, if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, would England been able to hold on long enough against Hitler?
Whew. No, I don't think so. Now, you know, even in World War I, we came in April. The Germans, the British had set in World War I, November, if they didn't somehow get through the deprivations that the blockade was having, they were going to have to give up. Surrender, I don't think they would have allowed themselves to be taken over, but they were going to give up on the war. So I think it was very similar. I never read a study like how much longer they had, but they were pretty screwed.
Winston Churchill had to be the happiest guy in the world with the attack.
Yeah, but they immediately lost Singapore and 2 of their capital ships within a week of that. So his joy was tempered. Yeah.
You said they changed over the Navy Admiralty from black shoes to brown shoes?
Yes.
How long did that take? Because 6 months after Pearl Harbor, they were winning the Battle of Midway. Were those the black shoes or the brown shoes that won?
Well, Nimitz came in and he cleaned house. Nimitz was brilliant. We had really good code breaking going on, and he made some remarkably brilliant decisions, particularly about Midway. You know, he gave Spruance and Fletcher, the 2 admirals out there, guidance like, okay, I want you to engage these guys, I want you to hurt them as much as you can, but don't risk your stuff to the point where we could lose everything. If it's starting to go back south, you know, get out. So he gives them all kinds of options. It's not like you go out there and stop them, because he must have known too. We're going to get submarines out there. We're going to get stuff out there. This could be their like black hole, and we could attrite those forces just through cutting them off from supplies. You know, can you imagine the amount of fuel they're burning? And if they couldn't get fuel to those guys, they got to go almost 3,000 miles to supply these guys. You know, so Nimitz wasn't going to bet it all on Midway. But he did take a big risk, and worked out really well.
Like Fletcher, is it like Fletcher, Admiral Fletcher? Was he like the holdover of the black shoes, or was he the brown shoe?
He was an old admiral. He had most of his career been a black shoe. And then at the end, when it became apparent to him, oh, being an aviator could be good, he got some wings, but he never really had operational flying stuff going on. Yes?
Yeah, so it's the island hopping, say, north of the Solomons and headed north. Rather than having the Marines hit the beach and face machine gun fire over and over again, why did anybody think about an alternative like just blockading the island and starting the Japanese out and not sending the Marines in? Was that ever an alternative?
I suppose somebody probably proposed it, but this is a maximum national effort. And, one of the things in a planning capacity you have as a military officer is you got to get this done as expeditially as you can, because it's just costing the nation tons and tons of money. And how long are you going to keep people motivated for this level of effort? So how long do you think the Japanese would have held on to the Gilbert Islands or the Marianas or some of those places? They'd still be there. They'd have started growing crops and doing whatever. I think the war would have lasted so long that everybody would have just, I don't know. I just can't imagine that scenario. And they even said that about Japan. When it came to the invasion of Japan, there was a lot of people after the planning revealed we're going to lose, and not only were Americans, we were going to lose 1 million, our estimate. There was an estimate that it was somewhere between 18 and 25 million Japanese would be killed if we invaded the place. So as gruesome as it is to say, but dropping the bomb, which killed several 100,000 Japanese, was kind of merciful as things kind of worked itself out. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, I think the other thing that went into whether to use the bombs or not was the country was war weary, and they were 16 million people in the military. I mean, they didn't know if they could
Right.
Yes, we could have done it, but it would have cost maybe 20 or 30 million people. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Would have taken a couple more years too, at least a couple of years till they stopped fighting. I mean, it was like this cultural fanaticism. It was just kind of a bizarre period of history for a culture that just lost their mind collectively a little bit. That'd be an interesting study for Father Rodriguez with his psych background to describe how you can mobilize the psyche of an entire nation to those levels of sacrifice, but they did. All right, anybody else? Thank you.